We made a huge mistake. We thought it would be a fun idea. I promise. Me and my roommate Nolan. We like collecting random weird stuff. Nolan likes thrifting and dumpster diving. I like to build stuff in the garage or collect weird trinkets. If you had asked me a week ago what the worst thing we had ever found when looking through the garbage was, I would have told you that it was a bag of dog shit. That was until we found these things. It was a few days ago, and me and Nolan were cruising through some local alleys in my car, looking for treasure. We had found a few small things, some cool old plates, a busted painting, and a nice wooden side table. We were driving behind a strip mall, passing some dumpsters, when Nolan grabbed me by the shoulder. "Dude, look," he said, pointing to a dumpster just ahead of us, where a set of white feet were poking up from the top. I immediately pulled the car over and parked it in front of the dumpster. We got out, hopped up on the ledge of the dumpster, and peered inside. Mannequins. Sick. I grinned. "You think we can actually fit them?" Nolan asked, looking at me. "We'll make them fit. Here, you fish them out, and I'll make space," I said, as I stepped down and popped the trunk of the car. I moved a few things we had found so far into the trunk, and pointed out that the mannequins could actually be stacked horizontally in the back seat. There were 3 of them. Definitely not brand new, but not too bad for a dumpster find. A few scuffs and scratches here and there, but it wouldn't be an issue. This was a good enough find to make us return home satisfied with what we got, which we actually did. We unloaded and stacked everything in the garage, and brushed off our new treasure, the mannequins. "What should we do with them?" Nolan asked. We both pondered for a moment. "You know what would be hilarious?" I started. "What if we put speakers in them and made them say creepy shit to scare people?" "That's fucking genius," Nolan smiled, nodding his head. We spent the next hour or two cutting holes in the backs of the mannequins' heads and taping some small Bluetooth speakers into them. We found an app that would let us broadcast our voices from our phones directly to the speakers. So we spent the rest of the afternoon playing around with that until we got bored. We sent a few pictures and videos of them to our friends, who actually all thought that we were crazy. The other 2 roommates we had were not thrilled at the idea of the weird speaking mannequins being part of the household, but we waved them off and told them that they would get used to it. However, I wish we would have listened to them. It was the next morning, as I was having a cup of coffee and browsing Instagram at the kitchen table that Nolan had brought, laughing as soon as he saw me. "Yeah, you got me good with that one last night, man," he said. "Huh? You know, the mannequin you put outside my bedroom door. Real spooky, huh?" he said. Was it me?" I said. "It must have been Amy or Sunny." "Yeah, sure, whatever. I'm gonna get you back though, just you wait," Nolan said with a dismissive wave of his hand, as he took a cup of coffee for himself and went back upstairs. That day passed as any Saturday would, mostly doing nothing. A bit of cleaning around the house. Later in the evening, we invited a couple of friends over so that we could crack open a few beers and have a fire in the backyard. We showed off the mannequins, and everyone actually hated them except for me and Nolan. We didn't really care though, but we actually put them back inside so that they wouldn't bother people too much. "I'm going to the bathroom, y'all. Does anyone need anything?" I asked everybody standing up from the fire. 1 or 2 people wanted beers, so I nodded and went inside. The bathroom door was slightly open and the lights were off, so I figured that nobody was in there. I pushed the bathroom door open. I jumped back suddenly as I saw one of the mannequins standing in the middle of the bathroom.
"Boo,"
came a voice from the speaker in its head. "Oh, fuck off, man," I said as my fear turned into laughing. I picked up the mannequin and carried it to the living room.
"Put me down. Put me down,"
the mannequin cried as I carried it.
"Unhand me, Rylan."
Shut it, Nolan, I said as I propped the mannequin in the corner of the living room. I went back outside with the requested beers and flipped Nolan off as I stepped down the deck stairs. He laughed and waved me off. We spent the rest of the night drinking and laughing. The fire was turning into coals and most of our friends had left by about 2 in the morning. I finished my final beer and I told everyone good night as I threw the can on our pile of empties. I stumbled back inside and pushed my bedroom door open. I was too drunk to be scared this time, so I merely chuckled to see all 3 mannequins lined up on the far side of my bed. One of them had its arm extended, the hand pointing to the bed.
Sleepy time,
said one of the mannequins. I sighed and moved all of them back out to the living room, wondering if rescuing these things was going to make more of a hassle than worth it. I went back to the room and closed my door and crawled into bed, falling asleep to the peaceful hum of the air conditioner. I woke up late and rolled over to check my phone. I scrolled through a few Instagram notifications, checked the news on Reddit, and then almost had a heart attack when I got out of my bed to make my way to the bathroom.
rise and shine.
Said the mannequin standing at the foot of my bed. The faces of the mannequins we had found were now blank, almost very smooth, without details. But Nolan had drawn a smiley face in Sharpie on this one. I reached over to my nightstand, and I threw a copy of the Game of Thrones at the mannequin, which hit it square in the chest, and made it fall over backwards to the ground.
Ouchie,
It said from the floor. I threw on a bathrobe and left the room. I showered and went about my Sunday. When I returned to my room to get dressed, the stupid mannequin was still sprawled on the floor, with a stupid smile on its face. I grabbed it by the arm and dragged it to the living room, where I propped it up with the other mannequins, which now also had smiley faces drawn on their blank faces. Sonny actually worked late that day, and Nolan and Amy were out doing something, so I had the house to myself. After I spent most of the day reading and playing some video games, I decided that I would finish off the last few beers left in the case from yesterday. I grabbed one out of the fridge, took a cigarette from my pack, and stepped out into the back deck. Alright, fuck these things, I said as I saw the 3 mannequins were standing in a circle around the fire pit in the backyard, holding empty beer cans in their hands. I set my beer down, walked back inside, and picked up the baseball bat that I kept next to my bed. I walked back outside. I lit my cigarette and proceeded to knock the head of the closest mannequin clean off. The white head went flying across the backyard.
home run.
Said one of the mannequins behind me, after which I immediately turned and slashed it across the torso with the bat. I laid into the mannequins, caving in the chest, knocking the heads off and bashing the limbs apart. I picked up the remains of the mannequins and carried them into the alley, where I dropped it all next to the garbage. From garbage you came, and to garbage you shall return, I said to the mannequin parts, and flicked my cigarette into the pile. How the fuck did Nolan do this? I said to myself as I walked back into the backyard. I then smoked another cigarette on the deck. I chugged my beer, grabbed another, and went back to my computer to play some more games. About an hour passed when the nicotine started to call me again, and I went back to the deck for another cigarette. I couldn't tell if I wanted to cry, scream, run, or rage as I stepped outside and saw all 3 of those fucking mannequins standing around the fire pit again. Their heads, however, were all now turned to face me, and where before they had smiley faces, all 3 of them now had frowning faces drawn by a Sharpie. The worst part, however, was that they all had duct tape wrapped around themselves, reattaching their arms, heads, patching holes, and holding them together where I had smashed them apart. I stood in stunned silence, blinking, pinching myself, hoping I was dreaming for a good minute. I actually felt afraid to even take my eyes off these stupid things. So, staring straight at them, I put the cigarette to my mouth, puffing out the initial cloud of smoke.
Ouchie.
Said one of the mannequins. Breaking our staring contest, I immediately strolled down the stairs, yanking the garage door open and grabbing the jerry can of gasoline that I kept for my lawnmower. I went back into the yard, snapped each of the mannequins in half, threw them in the fire pit, doused them all in gas, and threw my cigarette into the pile. The entire thing went up in a great rush of smoke, and the heat flashed against me so suddenly, I stumbled back from the fire pit. I did flip off the burning pile, and actually sat on one of our deck chairs, silently watching the fire burn. I knew on the inside that Nolan was most likely watching me from somewhere in secret, laughing his ass off at my reaction to these stupid dumpster mannequins. But I didn't care. I hated them at this point, and I didn't give a shit if I looked like an idiot. Once the fire had burned itself all out, all that was left were a few charred pieces that weren't really made out of anything, and a pile of molten, black, something. Plastic maybe. I don't know what they make mannequins out of. I made my way back inside the house, heading for my office. I was walking by the living room when I heard it.
Hot.
I stepped dead, too afraid to look. I slowly turned my head, and in the darkness of the living room, I saw 3 still humanoid shapes. They were charred black, with a wisp of smoke rising off of them to the ceiling. I felt my legs go weak and my heart started racing. I ran back to the bedroom and slammed the door. I threw everything on the top of my dresser to the floor and pitched the whole thing on its side against my door. I sat down on the floor of my room and started to write this. Please, I know that mannequins can't come to life. It's impossible. I know it is. How did Nolan do it? Why did he do it? They're not real. It's a joke. It has to be a joke. Please. You guys are the only ones who know about supernatural, creepy things. I need to know what's happening, or what's going on. I need to know that this isn't real, that I'm dreaming. It has to be that. But I never had a dream like this before. They're right outside the door. I know it, because all they're saying now, over and over, is
Sleepy time.
If you're reading this, congratulations. I'm most likely dead, or maybe worse. My name is Daniel, and I own quite a bit of land up in the Appalachian Mountains, left to me by my great auntie. So far, in the years I lived here, paranormal and downright disturbing things have happened to me here. People told me to just leave or report it, like I never done that before. To them, I'm just a young guy that went crazy a little too early. It bothers me that normal people have no idea what goes on up here, all alone. You see, my first encounter with them, I didn't know how to deal with them. I didn't even know what they were called until recently. It's important, or at least it's important to me that some of the tricks I have learned throughout the 3 years I lived up here could be of use to somebody one day. My second, or maybe third time I was being stalked by a skinwalker, it felt like I was walking in circles. I had a camera with an SD card pretty deep in the woods, but when I tried to walk back to my cabin, I kept passing the camera. I was walking in circles. This went on for hours. The sun was setting soon, and I was quite thirsty at the time, I remember. I sat up against the tree my camera was mounted on, and actually started crying. It was watching me, I guess waiting for me to fall dead. I hit myself in desperation a few times, trying to think. I sat up and took a very deep breath, wiped the water from my eyes, and it dawned on me. It's gotta be messing with my equilibrium. I have to be off balance. There's no other way. But I could still walk. But my depth perception was slightly off. All I had to do was tilt my head as far as it would go into my shoulder and walk back to my cabin. My ear was pressed into my shoulder, but even with one ear, I could still hear how anxious the creature sounded, pacing in the woods, hoping I didn't get away. Once I made it inside my cabin, I didn't come out for a couple of days for safe measures. Another trick they know is mimicking animals. I found that they like coyotes. I actually used to hunt coyotes back home, but never up here in the mountains. I seen a couple of my deer cameras that it looked like. Right after I left my camera, a coyote would follow me a while, if not all the way home. I had to stop that real quick and set out some snares. All the snare would and could do is jam the coyote's legs into the mechanism until a button is pressed, and then it could be unlocked. I set out a couple of them, but also rubbed some white ash on all the traps, and sure enough, the next time I started walking back from my camera, I hear the sound of one go off. I quickly ran back to where I had laid the traps, with a gun drawn, and all that was left was the trap in 3 separate pieces, and the scent of burning hair in the air. Every time I checked the camera after that, a coyote with a nasty burn scar on its leg would stop where the camera was mounted and turn around and walk back into the brush. And lastly, do not engage in any type of combat with them. Warding them off is one thing, but actually hunting them is a mistake. I wish I would have known that sooner. I had 2 buddies back in town I used to tell my stories to. Alcohol loosens the lips. Their names were James and Cole. I'm pretty sure they were cousins, but I never asked. Thinking about it now, I wish I would have gotten to know them better. But long story short, they're dead. And now, I'm dying. This morning, they came and pounded in my door insisting we hunt these skinwalkers. I told them it was a very bad idea, but they even took the liberty of buying silver bullets. They told me how much they cost, but I can't remember right now. I finally caved and we got ready all day. We first started making a large amount of white ash, cleaning our guns. Heck, they even packed MREs and special high-dollar spotlights. We set off right as the sun went down. We weren't 3 hours in when disaster struck. We were all sitting around a tree. I could tell that the skinwalkers were watching us. They're all around us, multiple. I'm scanning everything with my spotlight, not even realizing that Cole wasn't with us anymore. I asked James where he was, but he didn't seem nervous at all, and told me he may have had to go pee. I turned back to face my front, and there I see Cole. He's a good distance out, but something wasn't right. He was contorting in ways a human could never. I started to turn around to ask James what we should do, but halfway around, I heard James, guttural, sounding, breathing, like his lungs were filling with blood. I couldn't stand to be there anymore, and booked it back to the cabin. The forest seemed like it was laughing at me. In my desperation to run home, I knocked my flashlight running, and it was slowly getting dimmer and dimmer. I eventually had to ditch it and use some of the flares that Cole and James brought. I pulled the top off and struck it against a tree, and the red flame lit up the surrounding forest. There were so many of them, 10, 20, maybe more. But as luck would have it, they never attacked me. I could see the cabin and flung the door open and shut it behind me. I ran for the upstairs bedroom and quickly got into the old wooden closet where I'm currently typing this. I don't hear them, but they're outside my house. Unfortunately, in the midst of running away, I did end up getting clawed, or maybe bit. It's not a terrible wound, but it's bleeding black. If you're reading this, if you can, please send help. I really do need it this time. This story comes from Gallup, New Mexico. Family members are inside their home and getting ready for bed. All of a sudden, the dogs outside start raising a ruckus. The men of the family, including an uncle and some nephews, go outside to investigate, concerned about coyotes getting into the hen house. They think they see something moving about within the trees to the back of the house. The uncle picks up a handful of rocks and throws one after another into the trees. However, they hear or see nothing further outside of the ordinary, and so they end up returning to the house. With everything normal, the night is quiet and the dogs have stopped barking. They decide it's safe to go into bed. Just then, they hear a loud rustle from the trees, from the limbs whipping and branches snapping. They rush back out to the yard. All is quiet again. For 30 minutes or so, they stand guard, but not even the wind is blowing. The next morning, they go back outside and see that the gate to the hen house, as well as the door, is wide open. All of the birds are gone. The men end up searching the yard, and out by the outhouse, they discover, instead, an odd set of tracks going back and forth, as if something upon 2 feet was pacing between there and the trees. Finding no signs of the chickens, they return to the area around the hen house to look for similar tracks, knowing that only one person or someone similar could have opened the gate and the door. But the only marks they find are within the pen, and they all belong to chickens. The grandmother, who is standing at the back door of the house, tells them that it was a skinwalker. She says a prayer, and together they yell in a loud voice and in Navajo, "Go away, go bother someone else." It all started when summer came, and me and my 3 friends, Leah, Kathy, and Jennifer, were all planning to go camping. Leah asked her dad if he could drop us off, and he agreed. When the next day came, we started heading up. Leah's dad had set up the camper that we were using. He told us there were some spare blankets inside, in case we got cold. Leah's dad finally got into his truck and turned around. He stopped and rolled down his window and said, "No boys," to all of us. He then gave us a smile to let us know he was joking with us, and drove off. There was 3 rooms, 1 master bedroom, and 2 rooms with bunks. Each room had a TV in it, so nobody cared what room they got. Everyone knew that Jennifer didn't like small rooms, so we ended up letting her have the big room. I was in the room with Leah, and Kathy was in a room by herself. I started unpacking when we heard a loud noise outside. "Leah, did you hear that?" "Hear what? That noise?" We both looked at each other, startled, and then continued unpacking. But something seemed off. It was the fact that Leah was so chill about it. I was done unpacking, so I walked outside and started a fire. Jennifer walked out, and then she asked if I saw it. I responded with, "Saw what?" That's when she started freaking me out. She then started staring at me, but behind me, panicking. Her eyes darted back and forth, and then she was calm. I felt as if something was watching me, so I turned around, and I saw an orb in the corner of my eye, reddish, black. but by the time I turned around to fully look, it was gone. I was so freaked out because we were in the middle of nowhere, you can say, and it was only the three of us by ourselves. I then told Kathy that she could cook instead. We had her family's secret recipe of shepherd's pie and a bunch of vanilla cupcakes. There were about a dozen cupcakes left in the open box, so we just left it on the table and went to bed. I could hear the TV coming from Kathy's room, so I punched the wall and told her to be quiet. Right after I said it, everything went quiet. But then, there was a small scream in the distance. It didn't sound human. It gave me chills that ran down my spine. But I ended up dozing off. But then, I woke up in the middle of the night, hearing noises, like if someone was in the kitchen. I wake up Leah, and then we walk out into the small hallway that led into the kitchen. We saw Jennifer sitting on the table, just staring straight ahead, with Kathy being right behind me. We were looking at her, and Jennifer was making weird noises, weird sounds. She was really creeping us out. She never did this or stared into space this often. But then I noticed something in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow. It was staring at Jennifer, and then it slowly turned to face me and Kathy. I froze. Kathy froze. Then Jennifer looked at us, as if she was being mind controlled. And then this figure, or shadow, ran out the window, and Jennifer dropped her head into the table. We were trying to wake her up afterwards, but she wouldn't wake up. This experience still scares me to this day, and it is only one of the creepiest things I have ever seen. Me and the others are still very close friends. We even live together now. But we all remember that night and whatever it was that we saw. It turns out that Jennifer remembers seeing it in the daytime, but she says she doesn't remember anything when nighttime came and when we saw it. It freaks us out even more now, knowing that our friend wasn't even awake and staring into space with her eyes wide open. So I want to first say that I don't know much about skinwalkers and other creatures of similar nature. I just now started learning of their potential existence. So now I'm willing to learn and be educated even more on these topics, especially ever since I came across something at night. There's this park my girlfriend and I, we used to go to smoke there a lot, and we encountered this same dog-like thing multiple times, and it was always at night. It looked like a really huge black dog with round bear-like ears and yellowish eyes. The first few times we saw it, we didn't think much of it, but then we noticed that it kept just like spawning in. It never made a sound, and it always just stared at us, and it would follow us around the park in a creepy way. And just an FYI, we encountered this dog while we were high and while sober on many different occasions. Anyways, we ended up not going to that park no more. But before we stopped going, one of the creepiest things that's ever happened to me happened at that park. We were walking from the parking lot to the park, and we would just see this thing emerge from behind a tree and follow us and try to block our path back to the car. Sometimes we had to run and jump a fence just to get away from it. We never had a single dangerous interaction outside of this one time we were at the deepest corner of the park that was bordering a small forest, and we had to jump about 2 fences to avoid that thing. I do have a theory. It could be a stray, but it really did not act like a dog at all. It didn't even feel alive. I felt like it was just actually watching us for some reason, but it was really eerie. I'm going to start this off by saying it's a long read, but it's worth it. My friend and I were talking about this creepy experience we had, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. So I figured I'll turn to Reddit for some answers, if there are any. People might think that this is fake, but I don't care, whether you believe it or not. I have no clue if this animal or creature is a skinwalker, or just a very creepy animal. This took place around 2019, and I do live in Tennessee, right on the outskirts of the Appalachian Mountains. So here it goes. 2 of my friends and I were driving on a desolated back road at night. We were jamming to music and talking. Everything was normal. I was driving. My friend Hannah was in the passenger seat, being the DJ, and our friend Chris was in the back seat behind me. Hannah was trying to pull up a song on YouTube that wasn't on Spotify, so it was silent for a bit. While she was waiting on the website to load, Chris and I were still talking. We then came up on a small animal in the road, but I didn't think anything of it. Well, I expected the animal to move pretty quickly once it saw us coming down the road, but it didn't. As I got closer, I slowed down to let the animal have enough time to run off, but it still stayed very still. It almost looked frozen, and the closer I got, I could make out that it looked like some kind of cat. The only thing was, it didn't look like any sort of cat I ever seen. It looked like it had fur, but the fur was flesh colored. Its ears were very small, almost like the ears of a kitten, even though it was only a tiny bit bigger than a house cat. It was laying in a way that looked like the Sphinx was facing us. The scariest thing about it, though, was its eyes. Not to sound over dramatic, but its eyes literally looked like the pits of hell were burning inside of them. They were bright red, orange-like, and had twinkles of yellow in them that reflected off the headlights. As we got closer, the whole car was silent, and I just stared ahead. This cat scared the shit out of me, and it still wasn't moving. I felt a huge pit in my stomach and began having intense anxiety. It was almost like I was frozen, but I was not about to stop to figure out what this cat was. At this point, I had to steer around a bit to pass it without hitting it. I was like 3 inches away from touching this thing, and as I slowly crept by it, I watched it through the window the entire time, and it didn't even flinch, and the eyes still had the same glow even without my headlights directly on it. After we passed it, about 5 seconds later, Chris yells, "What the fuck was that?" I immediately start freaking out and shout, "I don't know." Hannah looks up from her phone and says, What did y'all see?" She looked behind us and kept asking. We explained what happened, and she said, "I didn't see anything behind us." Chris and I looked back, and sure enough, it was gone. We drove up the road to a church and turned around in the parking lot. We now wanted to get back to Hannah's as soon as possible. When we got back, we rushed in and told her mom what we saw. But we didn't mention that it looked like a cat. We described it as a small animal. Her mother stops for a minute and says, "Was it a cat?" We were blown away. We told her it was. And she said that her and a cousin came across the same exact thing when they were teens, only it was in a different area, and they saw it peeking out of the bushes. She still to this day doesn't know what it was, and she said that she thinks about it from time to time, even after 30 years. So I guess I want to know a few things. What was this? It didn't look like a bobcat, mountain lion, or fox. Is it a demon? skinwalker, wendigo, or unknown creature. I heard all of the legends regarding the woods at night. Don't look up in the trees, don't respond if your mother calls your name. But everyone I have told this to tells me it was most likely a scared bobcat, or that they never heard of anything else before. So if anyone makes it this far and has some answers, I would greatly appreciate any answers. This happened directly to me. At the time of the story, I was a 12-year-old male who lived in California. For a summer trip, me and my family flew to Idaho for a week to stay with my cousins. We stayed at their house for 2 days, then came the best part, until what happened, that is. On the third day, we drove to a small city in the Rocky Mountains of central Idaho. They owned a cabin. The first day was fishing at nearby lakes, playing games, and meeting a few of the neighbors on the small street. Everyone we met was nice. It was amazing. I thought nothing could go wrong. Let me stop here, and before I say more, here's a layout of the area. The room where I slept was at the back of the house. There was no fence at the back of the backyard because it was on the bank of a freezing cold river. Directly on the other side of the river was a huge mountain covered by a thick forest of pine trees. A small path starts on the other side of the river, but there's no bridge. But there is a bridge, a quarter of a mile down the road, in front of our house. I went to bed that night, and I woke up around 2 in the morning, needing to use the bathroom. I got up and did my thing, then headed back to my room. As I got into bed, I felt hot, so I opened my window. Not even 15 minutes after I opened my window, I heard the most terrifying screech come from the forest. It was raspy, but a high-pitched voice. I know for a fact it wasn't human. I heard plenty of stories from YouTube channels that often describe creatures that make weird noises that sound sort of human, but aren't. I heard it once more, but this time, closer. I eventually fell asleep after not hearing it for a while again. In the morning when I woke up, we explored the town. At around 7 p.m., me and my sister and my cousins got permission from our parents to go explore the forest. I felt uneasy, considering the creepy human-like noises in the night that I was hearing. The oldest cousin, Alex, who was 16, took a loaded pistol, a lighter, and backpack of snacks. I carry a hunting knife and a flashlight. The cousin my age, Julia, took just a flashlight. My sister Brianna and the other cousin Karina, who were both 10, took some extra batteries and a small bag of candy each. We made our way across the bridge at the end of the street and back to the path on the side of the river across from the house. All of us began the hike to the top of the mountain. We made it to the top of the mountain in an hour and a half. The view from 9,000 feet was incredible. We then stayed a little bit longer up there, and at 8:55, Alex and I figured it was time to head down, and we ordered the group to the path. At this time, it was dark now, and the sun had fully set. Julia and I turned on our flashlights and shined them ahead as we walked. When we were halfway down the mountain, which was about 45 minutes into the walk, I got this dreadful feeling you get when you're being watched and followed. Seconds later, I heard something coming from the bushes, a few yards into the side of the path that we were walking on. I brushed it off as some type of small animal, and about 5 minutes after this, we heard a noise, and it gripped me with fear, and my heart dropped to my stomach. It was that same horrifying screech from last night, echoing through the forest from a mile or 2 away. I told everyone we needed to move faster, and we did. The noise went off again, but closer, and again, and closer. Whatever that thing was, it was moving faster than us. We were full on speed walking by then, but it still wasn't fast enough because soon the screeching stopped, and we heard loud steps 30 yards off to the right. I got that feeling that I was being watched again. Alex took his gun and fired 2 shots in the general direction of the steps. The creature backed off, but even though we thought it was gone, I still sensed we were being watched. As the river came into sight, it caught me and everyone else by surprise. I heard the path of gravel crunching behind us. As I looked back into the darkness, I saw the outline of something that resembled a human. I told Alex and his face went pale when he looked. We told the rest of the group quietly, and on 3, we all broke out into a run towards the river. Whatever that thing was, it was extremely fast. When we reached the river, we figured there wasn't enough time to get to the bridge, which was still a quarter of a mile further along the side of the river. So we jumped in and swam across the ice-cold water. This thing got to the river just as we made it up to the bank and into the backyard. Julia and I shined our flashlights and finally got a good look at it. It was a massive, hairy creature that was about 7 feet tall. It had huge, razor-sharp claws like a bear. Its eyes glowed red when the flashlight shined on them. Alex then took a shot at it, and it darted off within one final screech. We all looked at each other scared. Alex then explained everything to our parents. They didn't know what to make of it, and had never heard of anything like it. I'm thankful that nothing happened to us, and also that I had noticed the creature behind us. If I hadn't, one of the others might not have noticed it until it was too late. The next time I stay at that cabin, I'm never going into those woods again. My father told me a story once. I'll never forget it, for a few reasons, that is. I think it's the first story he ever told me as a child. It's also the story of how my grandfather died. But to be honest, that isn't the reason. You hear stories on TV, or sometimes you overhear something in a public place. People talk about a ghost, aliens, and you think to yourself, this isn't real. They're making it up. Or they're mistaken. Or they're crazy. Or something along those lines. You just can't believe it until something happens. Something that brings it all together. Connects the dots in a way you didn't think of before. Maybe it happens to you. Maybe you hear the same story again and again, happening to different people. It doesn't take long for the world to become a lot bigger than you thought it was. As I said, this is a story my father told me. But I never believed it, even though he swore up and down it was real. It wasn't until I started clicking around the internet that I started to believe. I started to hear other stories just like the one my father told me. It didn't take me long to believe in the rake. That's not what my father called it, of course. He's never used the internet in his life. He wouldn't know what the consensus has taken to naming it. When he chose to call it something other than it or that thing, he called it Skinwalker, after an old Navajo tale his grandfather told him. But I'm gonna tell you the story exactly the same way he told it to me. We were out hunting one night, he would tell me. Coyotes. We would kill them for $50 a skin. They lived on a dairy farm in Ohio. We would do it every night because we needed the money. Sometimes, while we were out, we would come on a deer and kill it. The landlord didn't mind it, and it could feed our family for a few nights and save us some money. Anyway, we were done making our rounds and heading home, walking, cause we didn't have a car or some four-wheeler back then. We would cut through the woods. That's when we came up on it. Blood everywhere. Splatter on the trees, in the grass, in the creek, everywhere. At first we figured it was a pack of coyotes. We had seen it sometimes. They can scavenge and start hunting deer or cattle. The worst was when they bred with feral dogs, but this was nothing like that. See, when a pack of dogs or wolves or coyotes attack something, they'll do it the right way. They'll pick one that's weak, or sick, or old, or just small. They'll hunt it, draw it into a corner, some place it can get out of, and they'll run it right to the biggest one, the alpha. And that deer will never see that alpha. It might hear it, but it won't see it. It'll just notice that its own throat is gone, and then it'll drop dead. It's quick and it's clean. But that wasn't what happened here. Something had run up on a den of deer. Coyotes won't attack a den, nor would a pack of wolves, because they'll get too much of a fight. There were three bodies, just torn apart. A leg here, a torso there. A predator doesn't do that. They don't leave behind scraps. Whatever had done this hadn't done it for food. It had done it for fun. But we didn't know that. We saw a bunch of corpses, torn bodies, and we think it's something we gotta take care of. I remember my dad telling me to go home. He thought it was a pack of feral dogs, but I wasn't gonna leave him, and I damn sure wasn't walking through 2 miles of woods alone, with nothing but a .22 and a pocket knife. He was only 13 at the time, so a .22 rifle was about the only gun he could use. Dad had a shotgun, and I wasn't going anywhere without it. It took me a while to convince him, but finally we began tracking whatever did that. It wasn't difficult either. We just followed the blood. It seemed like that thing bled a deer before it got away, or it dragged one for a mile. I don't know. I know that I never seen my dad scared before that night. We started hearing noises, and I've been in a lot of woods my whole life. I've been all over the world, and I ain't never heard noises like I heard that night. I heard things screaming. Deer, fox, rabbits, raccoons, birds, just scared. Keep in mind, this is maybe 12 or 1 o'clock, except the fox and some birds. Nothing was supposed to even be awake, but they weren't just awake, they were moving. I saw a flock of birds that night fly straight into trees just trying to get out of there. We came up on a pack of coyotes, nearly shot a couple thinking it was what we were looking for, but then we saw they were running towards us, and they ran right past us. Didn't even notice. Then some of the deer did the same. Then some rabbits, squirrels, foxes, even a couple of wild hogs. These things were supposed to be eating each other, and the only thing they cared about was getting out of there. We should have put it together that maybe whatever we were tracking, it wasn't something we were supposed to see, and maybe it wasn't something we could kill. I don't even know why we didn't just go home. I guess we were curious. I think that was my dad's nature, to go towards trouble, to fight. And knowing what I knew about what my father did during the war, my nature was to stay close to him. We finally get into an open valley. It was normally a soy field, but it wasn't in season, so it was just flat dirt. We saw the tracks then. A lot of the animals fleeing the forest had paved over the land, but where that deer blood was, nothing had taken a single step. It's almost like they were leaving it for us to find. The tracks were shallow. Whatever it was couldn't have weighed more than 100 pounds, but that didn't mean much. A bobcat weighing 40 pounds wet nearly tore out my damn throat once. All that means is that it's quick and hard to hit. So we follow the tracks, and it doesn't take us long to find out where it is. There's this old schoolhouse that sits on top of a hill. Half of it had been ripped out by a tornado, but nobody lived there. Not for a long time. We caught homeless people in there, sometimes, or druggies looking for a safe place to shoot up. We figured maybe that was it. Maybe it was some sick kid riding a high. But we didn't think that for long. We get within 50 yards, and we hear this noise, a screeching kind of sound. It was sort of made up of two different sounds. One was a high-pitched screech, another was a low-pitched growl. It was making both at the same time. We get within 20 yards and we hear the sound. I can remember thinking that it sounded like paper being torn apart, while someone was swinging water in a bucket back and forth. Dad looks at me, kneels down, and whispers, "I gotta stay behind him, 'cause we're about to corner him. Any animal will fight when it's cornered, especially when it's a predator. But we can tell by the tracks that it's just one." He tells me it's most likely a single feral dog, most likely rabid. The plan is to sneak up on it while it's eating, shoot it, and then keep shooting it till it don't move anymore. Then we slit its throat. If it gets to Dad, it's my job to shoot it or stab it to get it off of him. So he walks up, and I'm right behind him, just a tad to his side so I can see what it is. I wish to this day I hadn't. It was leaning over a carcass, tears off its flesh, and throws what it doesn't nibble aside. There's blood all over the brick, glistening in the moonlight. It's pale white, human looking, but not quite human. It had arms and legs like a human, but it sat like a monkey. It was hunched over. Its hands weren't normal. It had long fingers with claws at the end. So we see that my dad hesitates. He wasn't about to fire on a person, so he clears his throat to try to get it to turn around. I swear to God, all the noise just ceased. I ain't never heard true silence before that. Nothing, and I mean nothing, made any noise, which made it all the louder when it turned around, made this shrill cry, and jumped on Dad. He got a shot off. I think he missed. If he hit the thing, it didn't mind, but it was on him. I started shooting it with the 22 point blank, but it barely bled the thing. I got off 5 rounds, and then I started hitting it with the gun butt, but it wasn't budging. It didn't even acknowledge that I was there. It clawed at my dad, taking off bits of his flesh. It started on his torso, ripping off the skin. Then it moved up. It tore off his throat. It tore off his nose, his eyes. It scalped him. Then it started digging in and ripped off the bottom half of his jaw, the little bones in that tube in your neck, then his ribs. I don't exactly remember what happened, but somehow my dad's knife ends up in this thing's shoulder, and my dad ends up on my back. I'm running, and by God, I'm running faster than I ever run before or after, and it's following me. I end up back in the woods, opposite the ones we've been in. I'm heading towards the landlord's house, 'cause it's half a mile away. I can hear this thing screeching and moaning. I hear the tree branches crack and get thrown around. It sounds like someone's taking an axe to every single tree I pass. It's cracking so loud and often, but I just ain't looking back. Finally, I trip into gravel. I look up, and there's my landlord and a bunch of his buddies drinking around a campfire. I scream and I cry, and they come over. I'm telling them to call an ambulance, and he looks at me, and I'll never forget what he said. "What is that on your back?" he asked me. Just as he said it, he saw one of those god-awful flannel shirts my dad wore everywhere. It was what was left of my dad. Most of his head, his torso, but nothing after the waist. Suddenly, we hear it, screeching. He grabs me. My dad gets thrown on the ground. I'm fighting him, crying, 'cause I think we can still save him, somehow. But my dad had been gone before I ever picked him up. He has to pick me up and throw me inside before I come with him. He and his buddies were all inside, and they're locking doors and getting guns. The landlord's asking me, what happened? But I just don't know what to tell him. He pieced enough of it all together to understand that there was something dangerous out there. All the lights in the house are on, and someone calls the cops. They'll be there, but in 15 minutes. We look outside and see it walk in front of the fire they made. Don't know what it is. One of them says it looks like an ape. Suddenly, something goes through the window. We shoot at it, but it ain't the thing. It's a dog. My landlord's dog. Just the body though, not his head or legs. We start pushing things in front of doors and windows when we hear something in the garage. I remember one of his friends saying that the doors were open. We hear metal and glass just get ripped apart. We put a couch and a TV in front of the door to the garage. It banged around some more, but then it got quiet. Not silent like it was before. We could hear it move around some, and the guys were talking, making sure the guns were ready. Someone hands me a pistol. No sooner did I cock the hammer back did we hear something shatter upstairs. Then we heard it screech again, except now it was louder, and it didn't echo and fade out, because now it was inside the house. We all rushed to the one door leading upstairs, and we got to it just as that thing did. It opened it just a bit, and 4 or 5 men just slammed into it. It got its hand through. Someone with a shotgun took care of that. Put the barrel right up to its wrist and pulled the trigger. Cut its hand off, clean. That only pissed it off though. It started pushing on the door, clawing. We were on one side pushing as best as we could, and it was on the other side doing the same. That wood wasn't just going to hold it, so someone tells us to keep our heads down. Suddenly, the top half of the door is just gone. My ears are ringing, and there are splinters everywhere. 2 or 3 of them just unloaded on the top of that door. I don't really know where it went after that. The police got there. I was still glued to that door, what was left of it. The sun was up before they got me off of it. They put me in a hospital for a while. A lot of people talked to me, but I didn't talk back. Not for a long time. When I got back home, I got a job from the landlord, working on the farm. We didn't talk much, not about that thing, but I signed up for the army when I was 19, and he sat me down to drink some scotch as a send-off. I then asked, right away, what the police told him. The story that they told was that it was a wild animal, most likely a wolf, or maybe a bear that had migrated north. I then asked them how they could say that when they had the hand. He looks at me, stunned. He tells me that the hand never made it back to the station. The cop who had it in his car wrecked, drove into a tree, and died on impact. The hand was never found, most likely taken away by an animal. The cops, when they would acknowledge the hand that existed at all, said it was simply the paw of a bear that looked like a human hand. I never talked to the landlord again. He went missing when I was in basic. The cops never found him. They said he owed some people some money and just ran away, but I don't think it's that simple. I never went back to those woods. I wouldn't even if I had the whole goddamn US Army at my back. But that was a lie. When my mother died, I don't think my father felt he had anything left, and that he might as well settle old scores. He went to those woods, and he never came back. The FBI was called. They did a show for everyone involved, but I knew they weren't actually looking. I had to get one of the agents drunk and slip him a few 50s before he finally told me that they get a few calls about those woods every year, about someone up and vanishing, but that was all he wanted to tell me. Before he got up and left with the rest of his team, he got a napkin and he wrote, "The Rake." I didn't know what he was talking about until I looked it up on the internet. But to be honest, I wish I would have rather not known. Before I start, Let me just say that the paranormal in Mexico is seen from a different view. It's part of our culture. The same stories that our great-grandparents heard are the same ones that are passed down to us. The stories of La Llorona, Nahuales, Brujas, and even the devil himself. They teach us from an early age to treat these things with respect and to not take them lightly. It's more than just witnessing an old chair move on a blurry security camera or hearing footsteps. It's part of who we are. And as my grandpa used to always say, de esas cosas no se hablan. We don't talk about those things. So this happened in the early 90s, when cell phones still weren't around. I was around 14 or 15, when my parents would go visit my abuelitos, grandparents, back in Mexico for the summer. They would of course take us with them. We would go over every summer when we weren't in school. And just as a side note, any siblings that my parents had were all living in Mexico, as we did not have family over here in Texas. My family actually migrated from Mexico and became first-gen Mexicans. Anyways, when we went to Mexico, it was almost a grand festival because my abuelito, grandpa, who owned the ranch, would slaughter a cow and get it prepped for everyone to enjoy those weeks we were in town. It was exciting to see all my family and see all my grandparents. So we stayed in a rancho that was owned by my grandpa. It was a huge terreno, a land, full of goats, sheep, cows, and all kinds of livestock. We would sometimes drift out into the woods to play hide and seek, just be kids, climb up trees, and enjoy the nature as much as we could. Even though we were all poor, we knew how to enjoy the little bit that we had, simply by playing with sticks and just whatever objects we could find. Sometimes even get yelled at by family for playing with the animals. But the best times out of all this was just being outside, enjoying the nature late at night, letting the cool air hit you, and just being surrounded by family. And the best part of all this was telling scary stories. The whole family would share scary stories, and sometimes we would have our uncle or aunt who were so drunk that they would tell the same story over and over again. My grandma used to tell us a story about a drunk guy who would leave the fiesta club and walk through the terrenos late at night, encounter a beautiful young lady, and when she would turn around, she had the face of a horse. My grandpa used to tell us about his experiences while tending his livestock during the week. He always used to say how there were crows that would be laughing at him when he was outside working. He said that one day he was tired of them and he was trying to shoot them, but he would always miss and they would fly away, cackling. But one of those nights when we were outside telling scary stories around the campfire, my uncle busted out with, "Oye, platícales de la historia del nagual. Tell them about the story of the nagual, Skinwalker." My grandpa just stared at him. Let me explain that the word Skinwalker is tied to the Navajo nation, which is basically a witch with the power to shapeshift. Well, in Mexico, we have what you call the nagual, which comes from the Aztec language family of my ancestors, including the nagual language. In summary, a lot of people say the Skinwalker belongs to natives, and I agree. The nagual is a native in Mexico. A few seconds passed and my grandpa just kept staring at my uncle. I then said that I wanted to know, and my grandpa responded with, "No, mijo, de esas cosas no se hablan aquí, porque así es como los invitas en tu vida. No, son, we don't talk about those things here, because that's how you invite them into your life." It was an awkward silence, and the conversation shifted to something else. After some jokes and laughing, it was around 1 a.m., and it was decided to go inside and hit the hay. As I was in the room with my cousin, who lives in Mexico, there in the ranch, and I asked them about the nagual. He told me that they had encountered a nagual a few weeks ago and chased it but ran away. Last week, before we all arrived, they found some goats, almost decapitated, hanged on his fence with their tongues ripped out. And a few days ago, when he was sleeping, he said he heard what sounded like loud footsteps outside their house. When he went to wake up our grandpa, he went outside and didn't see anything. Since then, he said he's been calling a priest to come bless the house and the ranch itself. The next day I woke up to the sound of my uncles and others making noise and banging on my door, telling us that it was time to get to work. Yeah, for those who are wondering, we still had to work simply by helping out with the livestock. So after about an hour of sleeping in, we decided to go outside and help them out. As we step outside the porch, my cousin says that my grandpa should be about 3 acres that way, so we start walking. As we are walking, I ask him about the nagual again. As I'm following my cousin, he says, "Look, you see your aunt over there? She's tending the goats and sheep, but she's actually saying a prayer over all of them, because they say the nagual can shapeshift into anything." Now it makes sense as to why this year, when we went over to the ranch, Grandpa wanted us to not wander out in the woods this time when we went to visit them. Nothing happened after that, and that was the whole talk of the Skinwalker. To be honest, I just didn't feel safe no more in the ranch. Even when we were outside gathered around the campfire, I would always be checking my back and staring deep in the woods. Now that I think about it and reflect back on these moments, I always felt like something was drawing me out there, almost calling my name. Unfortunately, that was the last year we went to the ranch. Apparently, there was some dispute between my grandpa and some drug cartel leaders that wanted to, quote, purchase the land from Grandpa. To be honest, I'm glad my grandpa got rid of it, because after that story and that year, I didn't feel safe going there no more. Even now, just because of what happened there and the stories that my cousin told me, I just don't feel safe around any woods or talking about these things. There's a reason why it took me around 15 years to finally speak about this. Has anybody else had any encounters like this? Let me know. As legend goes, to become a skinwalker, you must attain priesthood and then kill a member of your own family. Then, and only then, can you gain the powers to shapeshift. Then, and only then, are you a true skinwalker. According to local folklore, a man had just done that. An Indian priest not only killed one, but 5 immediate members of his family. They never caught this man. He disappeared into the woods, never to be seen again. When Jason and Alex set out for their camping trip, they knew all the old legends, and they laughed at the idea that a skinwalker would come get them if they ventured out onto the old native land, the same land that the supposed murders took place. And why should they believe the legends? A legend of a man becoming a beast? Jason and Alex were brothers. They spent their entire lives together until Jason had gotten married. Then, Jason moved away and started a family. But not Alex. Alex stayed in their hometown, tending to their parents, making an honest living off the land, and try to be a good person. And Alex had succeeded at this. He hadn't broken a commandment in years, and was well on his way, well, in his own mind, to heaven. 3 years had passed between their last get-together, and 3 more might have passed if Alex didn't insist on a camping trip. But insist he did, and there they were. It was getting dark, and the 2 of them were laying out under the stars. They were deep in the woods, and they had no GPS or maps, but they knew the path back from where they were. They had gone there as kids. "Never know, huh?" Alex replied. He only caught bits and pieces sometimes. "We can never let Dad know," Jason said. "Know what?" "That we stayed on the old native land past dark." We promised him as kids, and I wouldn't want to upset him now. He's getting pretty close to dead, and if we started an argument now, we may not resolve it in time. For, just don't tell him or Ma, okay? Okay, sure. They both were silent for a while, until up creeped a small raccoon. Well, look at that, Alex called, as he pointed towards the critter. It stared at them for several minutes, not moving, not attempting to flee when they motioned towards it. It stayed, almost perfectly, still. And then, finally, it left. Minutes later came a deer, and again the creature stayed and watched them. Unwavering determination glared in its eyes. For almost 2 hours the brothers were kept awake, as every animal they knew to live in the forest, and some they were almost sure that didn't inhabit the area, came to gaze upon them. The final animal was a gray wolf. It slowly moved towards them, and when it was 5 feet away, it stopped. Don't move. Don't panic. It'll go, Jason assured Alex. The wolf slowly stood up on its hind legs, and then its limbs began to contort and pop. Horror slid over Jason and Alex's faces as they saw the fur tear open, revealing light brown flesh underneath. Finally, they gazed upon what looked like a man with a wolf head. The skull of the wolf split open like a melon, the fur sliding off of it, the bone chipping and falling like a fragile eggshell. And then in its pace, slowly grew out the head of a man. The man now stood before the paralyzed brothers. They couldn't seem to move.
This is my land,
said the man with an almost supernatural smile. Get the fuck away from us, Jason said as fiercely as he could. The man began to laugh, and as he continued to laugh the pitch changed. It grew deeper, from that of a man to that of a demon, and soon it sounded as if the devil himself was out to get them. The man's skin grew black as coal, and his eyes yellow like a cat's. His demonic laughter echoed through the forest as he drew closer and closer. The brothers being unarmed, they had no choice other than to flee, and that's what they did. They ran as fast as they could, except instead of out to their cars, they were cornered into running deeper into the woods. For hours they seemed to play cat and mouse. Several times animals they passed would burst open, revealing the deranged man, but they continued to run. Finally, reaching a cabin, they ducked inside. They were filled with fear, and the brothers felt that leaving the cabin would result in them dying. What they found in the cabin made them regret their ignorance on legends. For in the main bedroom of the cabin were corpses, at least 100 of them. Every animal they had seen that night was there. And then they saw larger bodies, human bodies. It was then that the man burst into the room, except he was once more a wolf. In his deep voice, he said,
welcome home.
The following week, the police found the cabin during their search for Jason and Alex. They found the brothers, but their faces looked as if they were eaten by an animal of some sort. 6 days later, a security camera several states over caught Alex filling up a car with gas. Several witnesses also reported seeing the dead man, and on nearly all accounts, he was seen smiling, a wide, unnatural grin. It was late June of 1968. My dad was 12. My grandparents had moved a few months earlier from Tucson, Arizona, to Concho, Arizona. Concho was very different, both in landscape and temperature. Sitting at 5,000 feet above sea level, the summer temperatures were around 70 degrees versus the hundreds in summertime Tucson. Resting at the edge of the White Mountains, the land is red, yellow, and brown sandstone cliffs and buttes against a larger ancient basalt flow ridge that lines the north from the Springville Volcanic Range. Well, Old Concho, as it's referred to now, sits among the high desert with large basalt ridge bordering the east and north. In the valley, a dry riverbed was dotted by large cottonwood trees. The buttes and ridges boasted large twisted cedar trees. Only about 200 people lived in Concho at the time. It's in pretty close proximity to the petrified forest. Therefore, petrified wood was found on the valley floor. There were also numerous ancient Anasazi ruins scattered along the valley. My great uncle had moved his family to Concho as well. My grandpa had recently finished his engineering degree, and he and my great uncle were doing highway construction all around the White Mountains. They had both purchased land in the Concho area for pretty cheap. My great uncle had two sons who were a year older and a year younger than my dad, Tony and Zach. Tony was 13 and Zach was 11. They would spend their days exploring the surrounding landscapes, joined by my dad's American bulldog, Sarge. They had found quite a few ruins, numerous pictographs, and some old abandoned homesteads, most likely from the 19th century. Every morning, they would load up their bags with canteens, bologna sandwiches, and head out into the wilderness to play and explore. My grandparents and great aunt and uncles had only one rule that was for the children, and that was to return by sunset. As my dad recalls, on one summer morning, they ended up hiking towards the edge of the giant basalt ridge to explore. After going for about a mile or so, they came upon an arroyo running adjacent to the ridge. Large black boulders and giant slabs of sandstone peppered the wash. The banks were pretty steep, but they would have to cross it if they want to explore the ridge on the other side. They made their way down slowly. Once in the arroyo, they realized that the opposite bank was too steep to climb, so they started following it west to find a better place to climb up. My dad said as soon as they got into the riverbed, he started getting an unnerving feeling, like they were being watched. He said it was extremely quiet, no birds or cicadas chirping. It was hot as well, no breeze stirred the air. The further they walked down the wash, the more a sense of urgency began to build in his gut. He didn't say anything though, for fear that his cousins would laugh at him. About a half mile or so down the wash, it made a bend around a large volcanic boulder. Suddenly, Sarge began a low growl, hair standing up on his back. This actually startled all three of the kids. Looking around, they didn't see anything, so encouraging the dog, they moved closer to the bend. Sarge stayed rooted to the spot, growling and barking. All three of the boys began to get scared. They agreed that maybe they should just turn around. They noticed that there was a spot where they could climb out of the wash. They hadn't noticed it at first, but it looked almost like a game trail. With adrenaline fueling them, they hauled ass up the side of the embankment towards the ridge, the dog darting after them. The whole time the bad feeling was growing stronger with my dad. They stopped at the top to catch their breath. Sitting against a large boulder, they took some drinks from the canteen and assured each other that Sarge probably smelled a coyote or spotted a rabbit. Here, the game trail was more apparent. It had even worn into some of the volcanic and sandstone that protruded from the ground. They noticed that there were a lot of petroglyphs dotting the black rocks, geometric shapes, animal, human figures. There were so many. Finally, they found a large juniper with a trunk and ate their lunch in shade. Bellies full and excitement replacing fear. They hurried along the trail as it slowly zigged and sagged the side of the basalt ridge, avoiding large areas of rock falls. The pictographs began to change as well along the trails. Lots of spirals and horn-looking men. My dad even said there was one that looked like a UFO. Turning around a bend, the trail disappeared. Only open space of the edge of a cliff. There was nowhere else to go. The cliff dropped off to one side, and a sheer cliff going up about 50 feet on the other side. My dad, he was disappointed, but also a little relieved, as the sun was getting further west, and they were pretty far from Concho now. They could see the town in the distance, as well as the holy mountain and mesas that dotted the distant Navajo res. Even though they were disappointed, they decided that it was worth looking at the view. They started making their way down the trail when they spotted an opening in the cliffside, a side canyon. They hadn't noticed it on the way up. It was behind a large twisted cedar. The tree's shadow had hidden it. It looked almost like there was another trail going into the divide. The opening was about 4 feet wide. Looking at it, that unnerving feeling returned to my dad. His stomach dropped and he felt like it was twisting in knots. The hair on the back neck stood up. Tony suggested that they should detour and check it out. My dad protested, saying that they needed to get back. Zach stayed silent. He looked as scared as my dad felt. Tony laughed when looking at them and called them both sissies. He said if they didn't want to go, it was fine, that they could wait there for him and be babies if they wanted. That's when Sarge ran down the trail and was out of sight. My dad whistled for him, but he didn't return. Zach decided he would follow Tony, so my dad stayed behind while they entered the narrow black walled canyon. When they moved out of my dad's field of vision, the wind picked up, blowing through the canyon and trees, making a creepy sound. It was quiet except the wind, and my dad thought he heard faint voices on the air. He shivered, the ominous feeling growing stronger. 10 minutes passed, then 20, and still, Tony and Zach had not returned. A large cloud had covered the sun, and drops of rain began to fall. My dad moved under the cedar to get out of the light rain that began to fall. He sat on a rock and began to shiver. Suddenly, something grabbed his shoulder. He jumped about 3 feet and screamed. Then he heard laughing. It was Tony and Zach. They looked extremely excited. "Luke, you'll never believe what we found," they said. "We found some Indian steps and they lead to a cave." They begged my dad to come see. It wasn't far, only about 10 minutes into the canyon. My dad ended up following them, knowing they weren't going to agree to go home until they showed them. Plus, he felt a little braver and more intrigued now. Sure enough, around a bend, and about 20 yards into the canyon was more wide, about 20 to 30 feet across, and there were indeed foot and handholds carved into the rock wall. My dad had seen steps like them before, when his parents had taken him to Chaco Canyon National Park. They were smaller than the ones in Chaco, and only went up about 20 feet to the darkened mouth of a small cave. He shivered, from excitement or fear, he wasn't sure. From the bottom of the canyon, there was no way of telling how large the cave was. They dropped their packs and decided to use the foot and handholds to climb up to the cave, against my dad's better judgment. The rain had stopped, but they slowly and carefully made their way because the rock had become slick. It took about 10 minutes to ascend. My dad called for Sarge from the top again, and the dog still hadn't returned. The cave was much larger and deeper than they expected, and the entrance was decorated with hundreds of petroglyphs. The light didn't penetrate very far in, but they could see light in the distance from an opening in the roof, so they entered. Light adjusting to the dark, they started to notice that the ground was covered with objects. What looked like rocks and debris now revealed itself to be pots, beautiful, painted pots of all shapes and sizes, black on white, painted with geometric patterns, and animals, red pots and even some yellow ones, large pots holding dry corn and crusty squash and beans. There were also pots filled with arrowheads and beads. They even found some instruments like drums and flutes. They didn't touch anything and kept walking deeper into the cave. They looked around in shock and in awe. They had just discovered something big, something very big. They moved now towards the second bit of light streaming in from a crack in the roof. The cave was littered with all sorts of artifacts, stone axes, pots of all shapes, colors, and sizes. As they passed under the crack, they noticed now that there were objects and alcoves in the wall. My dad moved closer to one, and his blood froze. He was looking at a human body. It was decayed skin and hair clinging to patches and its mouth open in what looked like a silent scream. He took a leap back. Tony and Zach also froze. The walls were lined with alcoves filled with dressed bodies, lining the walls as far as they could see into the darkness. Suddenly, an ominous and horrendous screech broke the silence of the cave. All three boys jumped, and my dad, looking in the direction from where the sound came, saw two red and glowing eyes. He froze, locked in place by those glowing red eyes. Suddenly, the cave was washed over with the stench of decay and death. The eyes began to move towards the boys, slowly. Another hideous growl, screech, jolted them from being petrified in place. The eyes were moving fast now, right towards them, and they heard what sounded like running footsteps. They turned and tore out of the cave as fast as they could. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them in a blind panic. The entrance to the cave was maybe 30 yards away. My dad looked back against his better judgment and saw a man on all fours, or a giant coyote. He can't be sure. He pushed himself faster, screaming for the others to also run faster. They reached the edge of the cave, having to turn around to scrabble back down the foot and handholds. Zach got there first and began descending as fast as he could. Tony was next. His face turned into a wash of horror as he went down. My dad's heart was hammering into his brain by now. He turned and saw the eyes only about 20 feet from him. The stench of decay was overpowering. It made his stomach turn. As fast as he could, he placed his feet in the first set of footholds and started clambering down the rock face. He could hear the creature's breath now, and even feel it. He refused to look up as he was going down, trying to concentrate on the hand and footholds. He heard Tony scream from below him, and looked to see Tony lose his hold and slip about 5 feet from the bottom. He landed on his side and began to scream with pain. My dad slowed himself a bit, still not daring to look back up. After what seemed like an eternity, he leaped from the cliffside down the last 2 feet. Zach was helping Tony to his feet, and Tony was frozen looking at the cave and ancient staircase. All the color gone from his face. My dad was in full panic, and not looking, grabbed Tony and helped Zach drag him away. They flew down the little canyon. Finally, before they passed the turn, my dad looked back to see the red eyes watching them from the darkness. Another screech rang from the cave, and at that moment, Sarge in a full run came from around the bend, growling and barking. He ran to the foot and handhold staircase and bellowed up that cave, the hair on his back standing straight up, snarling and growling. The sounds of the dog filled the canyon. As my dad turned the corner, he saw those red eyes retreat back into the cave. They emerged from the small canyon and stopped briefly to catch their breath, the sounds of Sarge barking and growling echoing down the canyon. Tony at this point was now crying, his face washed with pain. His arm, he said. He thinks he broke it. Zach was silent. My dad was then asking Tony if he could make it home. Tony responded he sure the hell wasn't staying anywhere near whatever that was. Suddenly, a shrill cry came from the canyon. It was a dog, in pain. "Sarge," my dad cried, but Tony and Zach had started running down the trail. My dad screamed again, tears coming from his eyes. There was no response. It was quiet. My dad thinks he hears something. He looks up to the canyon entrance. It sounds like drums. My dad sits there confused. Drums? What the hell? Is he losing his mind? The drums are getting loud. Is this in his mind? Where is Sarge? He can't leave him. My dad sees Zach tearing back up the trail. "Luke, we have to go." The drums are louder now, and he can hear faint chanting. Zach grabs my dad and jerks him to his feet. "Don't you hear that?" He screams and shakes my dad. "We have to run, now." My dad is woken from his grief, as fear washes over him again. He runs down the trail with Zach. Tony is waiting at the edge of the arroyo, waiting for them. The wash is now running, about 6 inches deep. They notice for the first time that a large thunderhead has developed to the south. A huge, large black storm dominating the southern horizon, lightning flashing in the distance. A new source of danger crosses my dad's mind. He tells Tony and Zach they need to cross the arroyo as fast as possible. If it floods, they will be stuck on the side with the basalt ridge, with whatever that thing was. They make their way down carefully and slowly. Tony is having a hard time because of his injured arm. They now start hearing thunder rolling across the air, and the wind has increased. My dad is keeping a close eye on the creek, which has only risen a couple of more inches. They make all the way down and across the creek. The place where they crossed is only 30 yards or so ahead, so they scrabble their way towards it. The water starts rising now, at an alarming rate. They start going as fast as their legs will carry them. They're exhausted, but keep pushing on. Suddenly, my dad, who is in the rear, starts to hear loud splashing coming from behind him. His heart drops. It followed them. It's getting closer. He closes his eyes, bracing for impact. That's when he feels something lick the back of his swinging hand. He turns, bracing for impact, and sees Sarge. Joy fills my dad. He bends down and gives Sarge a quick hug as the dog runs past, and the dog bounds after Tony and Zach as they climb out of the arroyo. My dad runs and begins to climb. When he's almost to the top, he hears crashing and loud snapping coming from the arroyo. Making it to the top, he sees a wave of brown debris filled water crash through the wash. He falls to his butt and watches as the flash flood fills the little canyon. Tony and Zach are lying on the ground, gasping for air. My dad tries to catch his breath. He feels dizzy. He feels tears welling up, and Sarge comes and licks his face. My dad sees that Sarge is covered with blood. He looks over the dog and finds several slash wounds on his back. His ear is also torn. They don't look too deep, but he can't be sure. Zach is the first to speak. He is asking what it was, but no one responds. Tony's arm is beginning to swell pretty badly. and it's only a few hours till dusk. They're all thirsty and realize in their panic they left their packs in the small canyon, along with their canteens. They are no longer in a hurry. They are exhausted. They drink some rainwater that has pooled in one of the large sandstone boulders. They figure whatever that thing was, it's not going to be getting across the arroyo for a few hours. So they slowly make their way back to Concho as the thunderhead to the south continues to fill the landscape. The 3 boys and Sarge make it home around 8. The sun has set, and my grandparents and great uncle and aunt are worry sick. They are relieved and angry until they see the condition of the trio and the dog. The boys tell them about their horrendous tale, and Tony's parents rush Tony to the nearest doctor. That night, my dad sleeps with Sarge at the end of his bed. Despite him being extremely exhausted, he is plagued with nightmares. One that he speaks about all the time is especially terrifying, where he sees the red eyes looking in through his window. When he wakes up though, in the morning, his curtains are closed. The rain continued for 2 or 3 days. The boys don't leave their homes, still terrified of what happened. My grandpa and great uncle are convinced what the boys encountered was a mountain lion, but they are intrigued by the story of the cave they found. A few days later, when the weather is clear, they tell the boys they want to see the cave. They make the journey faster this time, using my great uncle's Jeep. My grandpa and great uncle also bring along a couple of shotguns and rifles in case this lion is still in the cave. The boys show them the arroyo, which has been filled with new boulders and broken trees from the flooding. They find the trail and start making their way up. My grandpa on the front and great uncle taking the rear. They find the boys' packs caught in a cedar bush. They have been shredded. My grandpa figures they must have been caught by another flood, and they ended up in the trees. They finally make it to the little hidden canyon, which has been blocked by a juniper that washed down during the rain. My grandpa and great uncle get the log out of the way, and they go to the canyon to the Indian staircase. When they look up though, they can make out the darkness of the cave. The water washed away all signs of the boys' previous passage. My grandpa figures maybe at this time of day, the cave is more illuminated, so he and my great uncle climb up the foot and handholds to the top. The boys wait at the bottom, having no desire to go back up there again. It's only my dad and Zach. Tony with his broken arm stayed home. My grandpa calls down for them to climb up. They do as they are told and climb up. When my dad reaches the top, he is stunned. The cave is gone. It's only a 20-foot rock alcove next to a black basalt cliff covered with petroglyphs. He's confused, looks around. He goes over to the wall looking for cracks and sees nothing. My grandpa and great uncle end up questioning the boys. Were they making up stories? No, they weren't. Something attacked Sarge, and the boys hadn't made up being that scared. The dads aren't mad. It's a neat area. Maybe some other weekend they will look for the cave again. My dad and Zach know that this is where the cave was. There's no doubt in their minds. They found their packs and even passed by the UFO petroglyph, but they can't convince the adults, so they make their way to the Jeep that is parked on the far bank of the arroyo. As they load up, sun sinking low in the western sky, my dad looks back at the black basalt ridge, wondering if maybe it was all just a dream, but something in the shadow of a cliff catches his eye. He squints against the sun and sees 2 red shining eyes looking back at him. His blood goes cold. He turns around as the Jeep pulls away. My grandparents only stayed in Concho for another few months. As soon as my grandpa finished the highway project, he got a job offer in the U.S. Virgin Islands My dad said after that encounter, he had nightmares every night and would swear that at night he would see the red eyes outside of the house until they finally moved from Concho. After he moved, he never had a nightmare about the eyes again. But it wasn't his last encounter with the red-eyed creature. He would see it again when he became an adult. But that is a story for another time. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'll share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far off. But I had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both of these cases bothered me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even more on the missing person cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she had never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours calling her name before they decided to call for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because nobody, including her mother or grandpa, saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and he tried to lead me straight up cliffs, not hills, not even rocky faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we sometimes find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but everything's so strange out here. One specific sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl had fell down and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken cry I ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. Apparently, she couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he was. We found him trapped with a broken leg. It wasn't pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMT guys that the man was saying strange things. He kept talking about how he had been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment and that he was wearing ski pants. He said he walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said that the man had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm actually glad I wasn't there to hear him say it. But can you imagine being trapped with a broken leg and hearing a faceless man running up and down beside you, screaming all night? I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and 1 co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving along the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree, facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do, so I decided to wait it out. And I waited, just staring at the man, while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A coworker and I head out into the general direction the teens had set off in. We had been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing strange things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for those teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night. Still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I noticed a bit of a shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close by the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and now they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple of weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, nothing, no ragness at the severed head, perfectly intact. This is weird because I've seen many wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains in South Dakota with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was still intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. Right smack in the middle of the trail. And again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers. Plus, why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the middle of the path. Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day, a kid finds molars. The teeth look like they belong to a human, but the teacher said they were a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later, they found the body with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All its teeth were missing. A local newspaper covered it, but all they had to say was thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. I found a deceased man in a tree. I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. The rest of the rangers say we found about one self-harm victim a year. So here was the one for this year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops. The medical examiner took an hour to show up. and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So basically, I stared at a dead body in a tree for an hour. I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail, and I heard someone walking up a nearby road. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles. And when he saw me, he started yelling, "I got a crowbar, I got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like, "Nice crowbar," and then I ran the mile or so back to my truck. I don't know my birthday. The date on my ID card, July 3rd, 1922, was invented by an Army enlistment officer. When I told him that I didn't know how old I was, I'm sure my mom knew, but she died before I could ask her. I would imagine it was written down in the family Bible, but that was destroyed in the fire. As for my pa, I don't recall him ever being sober enough to remember, if he ever knew at all. Never got no cakes or presents growing up. I don't think I'm over 100, but regardless, I don't have much time left. There's a story that I need to tell before I pass on. A story from when I was very young. I better start at the beginning. I was born in the Smoky Mountains on the Tennessee-North Carolina border, in a place called Blackberry Hollow. I was the youngest of 3 children. Had a brother named Jack and a sister named Mabel. Would have been more children, but my mom died giving birth to her 4th, along with the baby, a girl named Sarah. We had a small farm, about 40 acres or so, planted corn mainly, along with some turnip, potatoes, and greens. Kept a few hogs and dairy cows too. Weren't prosperous by any means. No one in the valley was. Wasn't easy farming on account of the rocky soil, but we did alright. Not from farming. My pa was too drunk most of the time to properly tend to his fields, but he did tend his still, hidden back on an isolated mountaintop, so no revenuer would ever find it. Lived about 3 miles from the town center. Wasn't much of a town. 2 churches, one a missionary Baptist church, and the other a primitive Baptist church. Which one we went to depended on the fancies of the woman my pa was currently courting. Couldn't tell you the differences between the two. The sermons always seemed to be about the various reasons you were going to hell for eternity. There was also a general store, which I never stepped foot in, best I can recollect. Didn't learn how to read and write till much later. And that was it for the town. As I said, it wasn't much. The town is now long gone. The government bought it up to form the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Heard that some of the buildings survived. Can't confirm that. Never been back to check. And never will, after what happened there. Now, as you can probably imagine, there wasn't no doctor in the town. The nearest would have been a good 30 miles away in the county seat. That would be a day's journey at least, over narrow mountain roads. No one had any cars in the valley back then, for even if they could afford them, there was no way for them to traverse the rocky path. So what you did when you were ill was go see the witch, Ma McDermott. Now, Ma McDermott looked like a hag from a fairy tale. She was nothing but skin and bones, her skin so thin and pulled so taut that it looked like her skull would burst through at any moment. Her bony fingers seemed to be twice the length of a normal man's and were capped with long, pointy, yellow nails. She walked stooped over, with the help of a hickory stick nearly twice her height. Strangest of all were her eyes, pale yellow like a daffodil. It was rumored that she was over 200, and I believed it. She had a small shack back in the woods behind the general store. Here she saw her patients. She could set a fracture, dispense a herbal remedy for morning sickness or the ague, and rub a salve on a burn. She knew some midwifery. In many ways, she was like the hundreds of other folk healers who practiced in the mountain towns. But she was rumored to have a dark secret. There was an abandoned grist mill deep in the woods, probably about 5 miles from the family farm. It was said that there, Ma McDermott practiced black magic, seance with evil spirits, and even called forth the devil. All of the children of the hollow knew to avoid that place. My pa, who given his near constant state of inebriation, didn't teach me much of nothing, warned me multiple times to avoid the old mill, and I listened, until one night. It all started the day my brother Jack died. Believe it was March, for I remember the fields were aflame, the farmers burning them to clear out the weeds and debris prior to the first planting. Jack and I were playing hide and seek. I was still counting down when I heard screams coming from the silo. I ran over and saw Jack up to his waist in grain, his arms flailing, being sucked down like it was quicksand. A few seconds later, he was completely submerged. My pa told me to run to a neighboring farm to get some help. He, along with 3 other men, spent hours scooping out the corn until they pulled out my brother. His body looked so peaceful, like he was asleep. But even as a young boy, no more than 5 or 6, I knew he was dead. I never recall seeing my pa cry, but he was clearly grieving. He became catatonic, lying in bed all day, not getting up except to get more whiskey. It was up to Mabel and me to feed the hogs, milk the cows. We should have been plowing, getting ready to plant, but we were too young to do that by ourselves. Finally, about a week after the accident, my pa finally got up. I remember riding into town, dressed all in black. I don't remember the service, but I remember the burial. As the preacher man was reading some psalm, I heard footsteps behind me. I looked behind and saw Ma McDermott standing right behind me, grinning from ear to ear like a mad woman. Before I could scream, she vanished into the thin air. Later that afternoon, I decided to go fishing, hoping to get the image of the witch out of my mind. Just had a little bamboo pole, but I was determined to catch a nice big rainbow trout and bring it home for dinner, hoping that it would cheer Pa up. I fished for hours, going downstream further than I ever had. All I got was a few nibbles. I sat back empty-handed, taking what I thought was a shortcut through the woods. The darkness snuck upon me, and I soon realized I was hopelessly lost. The temperature was dropping rapidly, as it does in the mountains, and I had on just a thin coat. I kept walking aimlessly, praying that I would find my way, when in the distance, I saw a little bit of golden light. I ran towards it. As I got closer, I realized it was an old mill, the big water wheel having split right into 2. Freezing, I began to run to the door, when what I saw through one of the windows stopped me in my tracks. Propped up in a chair was my brother. The top of his skull cleanly sliced off and set down on a long wooden table in front of him. Also, in the table were various vats containing chemicals of different colors, copper wires running between them. Floating in one of them was a brain. Presiding over this macabre spectacle was Ma McDermott. I tried to run, but my body was paralyzed. I watched Ma McDermott remove the brain and set it back into my brother's skull. Nothing happened for several seconds. But then, Suddenly, my brother's eyes opened wide, but they weren't his eyes. They were demon eyes, devil eyes. Somehow, they radiated evil, pure evil. Mom McDermott looked up at me, the same grin on her face that she had at the burial. She started cackling. I ran. I didn't know which direction I was headed. I just ran, away from the mill, away from the witch. I kept running, even though my legs had long ago given out, even though my heart was pounding harder than I knew it could. Never once looked behind me, for I knew I would see the witch riding her hickory stick, cackling, grinning from ear to ear. Eventually, after what seemed like hours, I came out onto the main road that led from the town to my farm. I didn't take a rest, but kept running, all the way back to the farm. My sister was at the door, crying. I hugged her for the last time and went upstairs and tried to wake my pa, but he was passed out from the drink. I told my sister that Mom McDermott was after us, what I saw, but she didn't believe me and went to bed. I made sure that all the doors and windows were locked and got my pa's hunting rifle out. I sat by the front door, the gun, which would have been too heavy for me to aim, resting on my lap. I must have fallen asleep, for I awoke to my pa shaking me. He picked me up and rushed us outside before running back in for my sister. As I sat in the cold night air, I saw, from the light of the burning house, a figure walking stiffly towards the pines, moving like he was hewn from wood. In his right hand was a torch, still ablaze. Despite the distance, I knew who it was, my brother. A few seconds later, I saw my pa running outside, carrying the body of my sister. She was dead. My pa said it was a rival moonshiner who set his house alight, but I knew the truth. I never told him. If he lived longer, I might have, but he took his life a few weeks later. I watched them walk outside calmly one morning, carrying a rifle. I watched as he put it in his mouth and pulled the trigger. I was sent to live with one of my pa's brothers, who was the foreman at a textile mill in Asheville. For years, I had nightmares that Mom McDermott, or my brother, or what was once him, would show up in the night at my window to snatch me away, but they never came. For my whole life, I have wondered what was Mom McDermott doing with my brother's corpse, what her motive was. I have never come up with any satisfactory answers. I just hope that when my time comes, I will be in heaven with my mom and pa, with Jack and Mabel and little Sarah. I pray every day that I will not end up in hell with the devil and with Mom McDermott, the witch of Blackberry Hollow. I'll never forget that night. I am a park ranger, and that is all you will learn about me, aside from this story. During the summer of 2008, I had been assigned to a watchtower in the middle of a heavily forest area. Most nights, it was uneventful, and I tended to just read a book as I waited for my shift to end. However, this night, when I started my shift, the guy I took over from was shaken up. Concerned, I asked what was wrong. All he did was shake his head and said, "There are things in the woods." He didn't say anything else and just left me standing there like a jackass. Jerk. Well, I set up for the night and took out my book. It was The Mailman, and I found myself surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Sometime around an hour into my shift, something struck the window. I jumped up and quickly sat the book down. Before checking it out, I had expected it was either a big bug or some poor bird. It was a bird, all right, but not what I had been expecting at all. This bird was dead long before it had collided with the window, both wings torn right off. and stripped of all feathers. It was bound together with straps made from long grass blades. This was the clear evidence that this was man-made. I quickly took out my flashlight and began scanning the area beneath me. I couldn't see much through the woods. However, as I did a quick double take, I swear, I saw a dark shape dart away from the light. I feel this needs some elaborating. I could barely make out anything, but when I brought my light over this thing, I only got a brief glimpse. I literally couldn't describe it for the life of me. This thing was fast. Too fast. Alright, listen up, you punks. If you're out there, show yourself right now. I used my most commanding voice possible. Nothing. As I drew my pistol, I heard the radio crackle. Naturally, I went to check and picked up the receiver. As I held it up to my ear, I could only hear static, so I at first assumed it was a glitch. But right as I decided to set it down, something stopped me. Call it intuition, something just wasn't right. And then I realized what it was. I could hear something over the radio. It was faint, so I really had to strain to hear it. Slowly, I could make out what sounded like faint, low humming. There was a pattern to it. A steady beat that started low, building up, then carefully dropped back down in an instant. I don't know how long I was listening to that humming sound, but eventually I turned off the radio, ready to radio it in. Then I realized I could still hear the humming. Without a second thought, I drew my pistol and turned around on my heel before steadily walking back outside. That humming sound sounded like it was all around me, following that same pattern. I still had to strain to make it out, but there was no question it was there. I swiveled around, pistol aimed at empty air. Every part of me was screaming to call for backup, but I wasn't sure what I needed backup for. I needed some proof of what I was dealing with, so I waited, on guard and ready, and then it stopped. As I became accustomed to the silence, I couldn't hear anything, not even a bug chirping. Cautiously turning my flashlight back on, I pointed it down at the base of the tower. Nothing whatsoever. Then I heard a creak. I immediately spun around, processing this information. At first, I dismissed it as the wood, but then there was another creak, and another. Something was up here with me. It took me a few moments to realize that it was just around the corner. In that moment, fight or flight kicked in full gear, and I chose fight. I rounded the corner and found nothing, absolutely nothing. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was nervous, but I still had a job to do, and with no other option, I decided to call for backup, which I should have done that a long time ago. I realized that when I saw the receiver had been cut right off, I stared, dumbfounded by a few moments before grabbing my walkie-talkie instead. But when I turned it on, all I got was a harsh whine right in my ear, which caused me to drop it as I recovered. Once I had, I immediately tried to find it, but it was gone. My situation was desperate. I was now completely cut off with some thing or other that seemed to defy all sense. If I was going to make it out of this, I had to stay put and wait for someone to come check on me. I still had my pistol drawn, waiting and waiting. I then quickly shined my flashlight outside one last time, and this time I finally saw them, standing among the trees, staring up at me. They had been avoiding me all this time, so to see so many of them, you might be wondering what they were. And I'd rather not tell you, for my sake. I was at my limit then, and screamed, turning off my flashlight and pointing my gun right at the door. There, I stayed for the rest of my shift, unwilling to move from that spot. I consider it a miracle I lasted for the rest of my shift. By the time someone finally arrived to see why I wasn't checking in, I poured out every single thing I had gone through. At first, the other ranger looked at me like I was crazy, but when he asked if I had any proof, something landed on the roof of his vehicle. It was another dead, naked, and wingless bird wrapped in grass. Needless to say, we booked it right out of there. When I got back and made a report about what happened, I demanded to speak with the last guy who had been on the previous shift. I really wanted him to have it for not warning me of what was out there. But here's the thing, we never found him. We searched high and low, checked every single record for a trace. We tried to look up his name, when we could remember it, but it seemed like he never existed in the first place. So, what the hell took his shift?